The door of the study closed with a sound that felt final, though it was no louder than any other day. Clara Bennett stood before the desk of the Duke of Nethercote, her hands folded tightly in front of her, waiting for words she had never expected to hear. "You are released," said Lord Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Nethercote. His voice was flat, stripped of any warmth she had once believed lived somewhere beneath his stern exterior. "Your services here are no longer required." For a moment, Clara could not move. She had served as companion to his late wife's sister for nearly 2 years, had walked these halls so often she knew every creak in the floorboards, every portrait that watched from the walls. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that she had become something more than a servant in this house. Now, standing before him, she understood how wrong she had been. "May I ask why, Your Grace?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The Duke did not look up from the papers on his desk. "There is no need for explanations. You will be given until morning to collect your belongings and leave the estate." Clara searched his face for something, anything, that might explain this sudden coldness. Just 3 days ago, he had walked with her through the East Garden, discussing the roses his mother had once planted there. He had laughed, actually laughed, at something she had said about the gardener's stubborn opinions on soil. That man was nowhere in the room now. In his place stood a stranger, wearing the Duke's clothes, speaking with the Duke's voice, but utterly without his warmth. "I understand," she said, though she did not understand at all. She dropped into a curtsy, the motion automatic, practiced 1,000 times before, and turned to leave. "Miss Bennett." She stopped at the door but did not turn around. "Take the north road when you leave tomorrow, not the south." The instruction struck her as strange, but she was too wounded to question it. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said, and stepped out into the corridor, closing the door softly behind her. Alone in the hallway, she allowed herself one shaking breath before straightening her shoulders and walking toward the servants' stairs. She would not cry. Not here, not where anyone might see. She had learned long ago that tears solved nothing, and pride, however cold a comfort, was the only thing she had left to carry with her now. That night, Clara packed the small trunk that held everything she owned in the world. 2 dresses, a shawl that had belonged to her mother, a handful of letters, and a book of poetry the Duke had once lent her and never asked to have returned. She held the book for a long moment, running her thumb along its worn spine, before placing it carefully among her things. Whatever had happened, whatever had turned him against her so suddenly, she would not leave empty of every good memory this house had given her. She did not sleep well. The candle burned low as she sat by the window of her small room, watching the dark shapes of the trees sway beyond the glass. She thought of the housekeeper, Mrs. Foss, who had always shown her a quiet kindness, and of the younger maids who had become something like friends over the months. She thought of the Duke's sister, Lady Rosalind, whom she had served as companion, and wondered if this sudden dismissal had come from her displeasure, or from someone else entirely. There had been whispers in the house these past weeks. Clara had caught fragments of conversation that stopped abruptly when she entered a room, glances exchanged between the housekeeper and the butler that carried more weight than words. Something was happening at Nethercote Hall, something larger than her own small place within it, and she had been too consumed by her daily duties to notice how close the danger had crept. She thought, too, of the letter that had arrived 2 days before her dismissal, delivered not through the usual channels, but slipped beneath her door in the dead of night. She had found it in the morning, sealed with no name, containing only a single line of warning. Trust no one who claims to act on the Duke's authority. She had assumed it a prank, or perhaps a mistake meant for someone else, and had burned it in the small fireplace of her room without giving it further thought. Now, sitting in the dark with her trunk packed and her future uncertain, she wished she had paid it more attention. Morning came gray and cold, with a mist that clung low to the fields surrounding the estate. Clara dressed in her plainest gown, tied her hair back simply, and carried her trunk down the servants' stairs for the last time. She passed no one in the corridors. It was as though the entire household had been instructed to look away, to let her leave without witness, without farewell. At the servants' entrance, she found only young Henry, the stable boy, waiting to see her off. He was perhaps 14, all elbows and awkward kindness, and he shifted from foot to foot, as though he wanted to say something, but could not find the words. "Will you be all right, miss?" he finally asked, taking her trunk to carry it the short distance to the gate. "I will manage," Clara said. offering him a small smile she did not entirely feel. "Thank you for asking, Henry." He hesitated at the gate, glancing back toward the great house, as though checking that no one watched them. "His Grace seemed different this morning," he said quietly. "Shouting at Mr. Grant, he was. Something about the carriages. I've never heard him raise his voice like that before." Clara frowned. "The carriages?" "All of them, miss. Every single one in the stables. He's had them sent out since dawn, in every direction. I don't know what it's about, but Mr. Grant looked fit to argue with him, which he never does." The information settled strangely in Clara's chest. A small stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples she could not yet understand. Why would the Duke, having dismissed her so coldly the evening before, now be sending every carriage from his stables out into the countryside? It made no sense, unless it had nothing to do with her at all. Perhaps some other crisis had arisen in the house, some matter of business or family that had nothing to do with her own small dismissal. She thanked Henry again, took her trunk from him, and set off down the road on foot. The North Road, as the Duke had instructed, though she could not have said why she still obeyed him after everything. Perhaps it was simply habit, 2 years of following his wishes without question. Perhaps some part of her still trusted that whatever had happened, whatever had turned him so cold, there remained some thread of reason behind his instructions. The road stretched long and empty before her, bordered by hedgerows still wet with morning dew. Nethercote Hall grew smaller behind her with every step, its gray stone walls fading into the mist until they disappeared entirely. Clara did not look back again. She fixed her eyes forward, on the road, on the uncertain future waiting somewhere beyond the horizon, and told herself that whatever came next, she would face it with the same steady composure that had carried her through every difficulty before. She thought of her situation plainly, the way she had trained herself to think through problems since childhood. She had no family to return to, her parents having passed when she was young, leaving her to be raised by a distant aunt who had shown her little affection and less patience. She had no savings beyond a small purse of coins earned through her service. Enough perhaps for a few weeks of modest lodging, but not much more. She would need to find new employment quickly, perhaps in the nearest town, though her references would come from a house that had just cast her out without explanation, which was unlikely to help her case. And yet beneath the practical worry sat something else, something she did not want to examine too closely. Hurt. Not merely at losing her position, but at losing him, the man she had come to know behind the Duke's formal title, the one who read poetry in the evenings and asked her opinion on it as though it mattered, who had once stood beside her in the garden, and, for a brief unguarded moment, looked at her in a way that made her believe, foolishly, that she was more to him than simply his sister's companion. She had been wrong. Whatever she had seen in his eyes, whatever warmth she had imagined passing between them, it had meant nothing when weighed against whatever reason had caused him to release her so abruptly. She would not make that mistake of imagination again. The road curved ahead, through a small stretch of woodland, the trees casting long shadows despite the pale morning light. Clara adjusted her grip on the trunk's handle and quickened her pace, eager to put more distance between herself and the estate, before the day grew any older. She did not notice, as she walked, the distant sound of hooves on a road that ran parallel to her own, nor the carriage that paused at a crossroads far behind her, its driver squinting toward the horizon before turning down the wrong path entirely. Back at Nethercote Hall, in the study where he had delivered his cold dismissal the evening before, the Duke of Nethercote stood at the window, watching the empty drive where Clara's small figure had long since vanished from sight. His valet, Samuel Grant, entered without knocking, a habit permitted only to him after years of faithful service. "The carriages are out, Your Grace," Samuel said. "All 6 of them, covering every road from the estate to the village and beyond. But if I may ask, and I believe I have earned the right to ask after 15 years in your service, why did you send her away with such cruelty, only to spend the morning searching for her as though her life depended on it?" The Duke did not turn from the window. His jaw was tight, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture of a man holding himself together through sheer will alone. "Because her life may very well depend on it, Samuel, and because there was no time to explain, and no way to warn her without risking everything I have worked these past weeks to protect." Samuel frowned, watching his master's rigid shoulders. "Protect her from what, Your Grace?" The Duke finally turned, and in his eyes was none of the coldness he had shown Clara the evening before, only a deep and gnawing fear. "From my cousin," he said quietly. "From Julian. And from whatever he intends to do now that his forgery has been discovered." Samuel's frown deepened. "Julian? Your own cousin, forging documents against you? What could he possibly hope to gain?" "Everything," the Duke said bitterly. "The estate, the title, the fortune my father spent a lifetime building. He has been planning this for months, perhaps longer, and I was too consumed with my own affairs to notice the danger closing in around us until it was nearly too late." He crossed to his desk and pulled open a drawer, retrieving a folded letter that had arrived only 2 days before. He handed it to Samuel without a word. Inside was a document purporting to be a confession, written in a hand that closely resembled Clara's own, admitting to the theft of a valuable necklace that had belonged to the Duke's late wife. The confession named no accomplice, but its intention was clear enough. Someone wanted Clara blamed for a crime she had not committed, and wanted her removed from the household before she could defend herself. "This came from Julian?" Samuel asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "I cannot prove it yet," the Duke admitted. "But I know his hand well enough, even disguised, and I know his motives better than anyone alive. If Miss Bennet had remained in this house another day, this forged confession would have been presented to the magistrate, and she would have faced consequences for a crime that exists only in Julian's imagination. I dismissed her to remove her from that danger, to buy myself time to expose the truth before he could act." "Then why not simply tell her the truth, Your Grace? Why let her believe herself despised, sent away in shame, when the opposite is true?" The Duke's expression darkened with something like pain. "Because Julian has eyes and ears in this house that I have not yet identified. If I had shown her any kindness in that dismissal, any hint that I did not truly believe the accusations against her, word would have reached him within the hour, and he would have moved against her before she ever left the estate grounds. The only way to protect her was to make her dismissal appear genuine, complete, so that no one watching would suspect otherwise." Samuel considered this, turning the forged letter over in his hands. "And the carriages, Your Grace? If your intention was only to let her leave in safety, why send every carriage from the stables after her?" "Because I do not trust the roads to be safe for a woman traveling alone," the Duke said. "There have been reports these past weeks of highwaymen operating along the routes leading from the estate, and I will not have her come to harm through some misfortune of timing while I sit here pretending indifference. I have instructed the drivers to watch for her, to offer her safe passage should she accept it, but to reveal nothing of my true intentions unless absolutely necessary. She must reach safety without ever knowing the danger she narrowly escaped, or the lengths I have gone to protect her." Far down the North Road, unaware of any of this, Clara Bennet continued walking, her trunk growing heavier with each mile, her thoughts circling endlessly around the mystery of her dismissal. The morning mist had begun to lift, revealing a landscape of rolling fields and distant farmhouses, smoke curling from their chimneys into the pale sky. She passed few travelers on the road, a farmer driving a cart of vegetables toward some distant market, a pair of children chasing a dog through a field beside the road, all of them absorbed in their own small concerns, none of them sparing more than a passing glance for the tired young woman walking alone with her trunk. It was nearing midday when the first carriage passed her. She heard it before she saw it, the rhythmic clatter of hooves and wheels growing louder behind her. She stepped to the side of the road to let it pass, but instead of continuing on, the carriage slowed, then stopped just ahead of her. The driver, a broad-shouldered man in dark livery, leaned down from his seat. "Miss," he called, "might I offer you passage? The road ahead grows lonely, and a storm is building to the west." Clara studied the carriage for a long moment. It was well made, clearly belonging to a household of some wealth, though it bore no crest that she recognized, the panels having been left deliberately plain. Something about the offer struck her as strange, too convenient, too precisely timed to her own moment of exhaustion. She thought of the letter she had burned 2 nights before, the warning to trust no one claiming to act on the Duke's authority, and though this driver had made no such claim, caution won out over weariness. "Thank you, but I prefer to walk," she said, and continued on before he could press the matter further. The driver watched her go, hesitating for a long moment before urging his horses onward, continuing past her down the road, as though his errand lay elsewhere entirely. He did not know, could not have known, that this had been his one chance to bring her safely to the next town before nightfall, before the road grew truly dangerous. He had followed his instructions precisely, offered assistance without revealing his true purpose, and accepted her refusal as he had been told he must, unable to force the issue without risking exposure of the very secret he had been sent to protect. Clara continued walking through the afternoon, her feet aching, her trunk feeling heavier with every passing hour. She stopped once beside a stream to rest and drink, splashing cool water on her face and trying to gather her scattered thoughts. She was perhaps 10 miles from Nethercote Hall now, with no clear destination in mind beyond the vague hope of reaching the market town of Ashford before nightfall, where she might find a room at an inn and consider her next steps with a clearer head. As she sat beside the stream, she allowed herself, for the first time since leaving the estate, to truly examine her feelings about the Duke's dismissal. There had been something in his eyes, she realized now, replaying the scene in her memory. Not coldness exactly, though he had certainly performed coldness with convincing skill. Something else, buried beneath the surface, a tension in his jaw, a stiffness in his shoulders that spoke less of anger and more of a man forcing himself through an unpleasant duty. She had been too wounded in the moment to notice it clearly, but now, with distance and time to reflect, the memory took on a different shape entirely. And then, there was his final instruction, so strange and specific. Take the north road, not the south. Why would it matter which road she took, unless he knew something about the south road that made it dangerous? Unless his instruction had been, in its own quiet way, an act of care disguised within an act of cruelty. She shook her head, frustrated with herself. She was inventing explanations, weaving comfort out of nothing more than wishful thinking, because the alternative, that he had simply grown tired of her presence and wanted her gone, was too painful to accept without resistance. She had learned long ago not to trust her own hopeful imaginings when it came to matters of the heart. Better to accept the plain truth of her situation and move forward than to chase shadows of meaning that likely did not exist. She rose from beside the stream, brushed the dirt from her skirts, and continued down the road with renewed determination. The afternoon light was beginning to lengthen into evening shadow, and she quickened her pace, eager to reach Ashford before darkness fell completely. It was nearing dusk when the second carriage appeared. This one came from the opposite direction, traveling toward her rather than past her, its lanterns already lit against the gathering dark. Clara stepped aside instinctively, wary after her earlier encounter, but this carriage did not stop. It rolled past her without slowing, the driver's face hidden beneath the brim of his hat, and continued on toward Nethercote Hall behind her. She thought little of it at the time, too tired and too focused on reaching shelter before nightfall to spare much attention for a passing carriage. She did not see the driver glance back over his shoulder once he had passed her, did not see him pull a small notebook from his coat and mark something down before continuing on his way. She did not know that this driver too had been sent from the Duke's stables that morning, tasked with a different stretch of road than his fellow, and that his brief glimpse of her walking safely along the north road would be relayed back to Nethercote Hall within the hour, offering the Duke his first small measure of relief since dawn. Night fell fully before Clara reached Ashford. The road grew darker, the hedgerows on either side becoming shapeless masses of shadow, and she found herself walking faster, her earlier caution giving way to a growing unease. She had never traveled alone at night before, had never needed to, and the unfamiliar sounds of the countryside after dark, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, the distant call of an owl, the wind moving through branches overhead, all conspired to fray her composure more than she wanted to admit. She saw the lights of Ashford at last, warm and welcoming in the distance, and felt a wave of relief wash over her tired body. She was perhaps a mile from the town's edge when she heard hoofbeats behind her once more, faster this time, more urgent than the leisurely pace of the earlier carriages. She turned to look, and in the dim light of a rising moon, she saw two riders approaching at speed, their faces obscured by dark scarves pulled up against the evening chill. Something about their approach, the deliberate way they slowed as they drew near her rather than passing at speed, sent a cold spike of fear through her chest. She had heard stories, as everyone had, of highwaymen who preyed on travelers along lonely roads, particularly those foolish or desperate enough to walk alone after dark. She had dismissed such stories as exaggeration, tales meant to frighten children into obedience. Standing alone on a darkening road, with 2 unknown riders closing the distance. She was no longer so certain of her earlier confidence. She gripped the handle of her trunk tightly, though what protection it might offer her she could not say, and cast a desperate glance toward the distant lights of Ashford, still too far away to offer any real hope of safety should these riders mean her harm. The road behind her offered no better shelter, only the empty darkness she had already crossed. She was alone, exposed, and entirely at the mercy of whatever intentions had brought these 2 strangers riding hard through the night directly toward her. Clara's heart pounded as the riders slowed to a stop just a few paces from where she stood. She braced herself, ready to run if she had to, though she knew her chances against 2 mounted men were slim at best. Then one of the riders pulled down his scarf, revealing a weathered face she recognized from the stables at Nethercote Hall. "Miss Bennet," the man said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Forgive us for startling you. We did not mean to frighten a lady traveling alone." Relief flooded through her, though it was quickly followed by confusion. "You are from the hall," she said. "One of the grooms, are you not?" "Aye, miss. William, if you recall me, and this is my brother, Thomas, from the village. We've been riding these roads since dawn on His Grace's orders, watching for trouble on the routes leading from the estate. There's been word of highwaymen working this stretch these past weeks, and we did not care to let a lady walk it alone after dark, without at least offering our company." Clara studied him carefully, remembering now his face among the many faces she had passed in the stable yard over her 2 years at Nethercote Hall. He seemed genuine enough, his concern evident in the careful way he kept his horse a respectful distance from her, giving her no cause to feel cornered or threatened. And yet the coincidence troubled her. Why would the Duke, having dismissed her so coldly, trouble himself to have his men patrol the roads for her safety? "Did His Grace send you specifically to find me?" she asked, watching his face closely for any sign of deception. William hesitated, and in that hesitation, Clara saw something that confirmed her suspicion, though he quickly recovered himself. "His Grace sent every carriage and every rider from the stables this morning, miss, to patrol the roads generally, on account of the highwaymen. I could not say his exact intentions beyond that. It was, Clara suspected, not entirely the truth, but she was too tired and too wary of trusting her own hopeful imagination to press him further. "I thank you for your concern," she said instead, "but I am nearly to Ashford now, and I would prefer to continue on my own. At least allow us to escort you the remaining distance, miss. It would ease my conscience greatly to see you safely to the town's edge before we continue our patrol." Clara considered refusing, as she had refused the carriage earlier in the day, but something in William's earnest expression, combined with her own genuine exhaustion and the lingering fear from moments before, softened her resolve. "Very well," she agreed. "I would be grateful for the company, at least as far as the town." The 3 of them continued on together, William and his brother walking their horses slowly beside her rather than riding ahead, matching their pace to her tired steps. They spoke little during the remaining mile, though William occasionally offered small observations about the countryside, the weather, anything to fill the silence without pressing her about matters she clearly did not wish to discuss. Clara found herself grateful for his restraint, and by the time the lights of Ashford grew close enough to illuminate the road properly, some of the tension had eased from her shoulders. At the town's edge, William drew his horse to a stop. "This is as far as I can escort you, miss." "My brother and I must continue our patrol before the night grows later, but there's a respectable inn just ahead, the Fox and Crown, run by a Mrs. Doyle who keeps a clean house and an honest table. Tell her William sent you, and she'll see you well cared for." Clara thanked them both sincerely, and watched as they turned their horses back the way they had come, disappearing into the darkness beyond the town's first scattered lights. She stood alone for a moment, considering everything that had happened since morning, the coldness of her dismissal set against the strange and persistent kindnesses that had followed her along the road. It made no sense, and yet she found herself unable to dismiss the pattern entirely as coincidence. She found the Fox and Crown easily enough, a modest but well-kept establishment with warm light spilling from its windows onto the street outside. Inside, she was greeted by a stout, cheerful woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Doyle, and who, upon hearing William's name, immediately ushered Clara to a small but comfortable room at the back of the inn, promising a hot meal within the hour and no argument about payment until morning. Clara ate gratefully in the small dining room downstairs, a simple meal of bread, cheese, and warm stew that tasted better than anything she could remember eating in months. The room was quiet at this hour, occupied only by a handful of other travelers, and she found herself listening idly to the murmur of their conversation as she ate, grateful simply to sit somewhere warm and safe after the long day's walk. It was there, over the rim of her cup, that she first heard the name Julian Nethercote spoken by strangers. Two men sat at a nearby table, farmers, by the look of their weathered hands and plain clothing, deep in conversation over their own evening meal. Clara had not been listening closely at first, but the mention of the Duke's family name caught her attention immediately, and she found herself straining to hear their words without appearing to eavesdrop too obviously. "Heard tell there's trouble brewing up at the hall," one of the farmers said, his voice pitched low but not low enough to escape Clara's sharpened attention. "My cousin works in the stables there," says the young master. "Julian has been asking all manner of strange questions about the household accounts these past weeks." "Aye, and there's talk of some missing jewelry too," the other replied. "A necklace, they say, that belonged to the late Duchess. Word is someone in the household's been accused of taking it." Clara's cup nearly slipped from her fingers. She set it down carefully, forcing her hands steady, and listened with every fiber of her attention now, no longer troubling to hide her interest. "Accused, is it? Strange business, that. My cousin says the young master's been the one pushing hardest for someone to be blamed, going on about it to anyone who'll listen, practically demanding the Duke bring in the magistrate before the week is out. Convenient for him, isn't it, if suspicion falls elsewhere? I've heard whispers, mind you, only whispers, that it's Julian himself who's been dipping into accounts that aren't rightfully his to touch. Man's drowning in debt, they say, gambling debts mostly, and desperate men do desperate things when their backs are against the wall." Clara sat frozen at her table, her meal forgotten, as the pieces of a puzzle she had not even known she was solving began to shift into a new and troubling shape. A missing necklace. An accusation someone was eager to see fall on another. A cousin drowning in debt and pushing hard for swift judgment before the truth could properly surface. And her own sudden cold dismissal from the household, timed so precisely against this unfolding crisis that it could not possibly be coincidence. She thought of the forged confession she knew nothing about, sitting even now in a drawer in the Duke's study, though she had no way of knowing its existence. She thought only of the shape of the danger closing around her, sensed rather than seen, and felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the evening's cooling air. Was she meant to be the one blamed? Had her dismissal been not an act of the Duke's displeasure, but some desperate attempt to remove her from a danger she could not yet fully understand? The theory felt too convenient, too flattering to her own wounded pride, and she forced herself to consider it with the same cold skepticism she applied to any difficult problem. And yet the timing, the strange instructions about which road to take, the carriages and riders sent out to watch the roads, William's careful evasion when she had pressed him about the Duke's true intentions, all of it began to align into a pattern too consistent to easily dismiss. She needed more information before she could trust any conclusion, however tempting it might be. She finished her meal in distracted silence, thanked Mrs. Doyle for her hospitality, and retreated to her small room upstairs, where she sat by the window long into the night, turning the fragments of overheard conversation over in her mind, searching for some clearer shape of the truth hidden within them. Meanwhile, at Nethercote Hall, the Duke received word from William's brief report, relayed through a rider sent back from Ashford, that Miss Bennet had reached the town safely and taken lodging at the Fox and Crown. The relief that swept through him was so profound that Samuel, watching from across the study, saw his master's shoulders finally lower from the rigid tension they had held since dawn. "She is safe, then," Samuel said. "For tonight, at least," the Duke replied, though his relief was already giving way to renewed worry. "But Julian will not remain patient forever. If he learns that she has not simply vanished into obscurity, if he suspects that I have taken steps to protect her rather than abandon her to his scheme, he will move against her directly, or against me. We must move faster than he expects, Samuel. I need proof of the forgery before he can act again, and I need it soon." Samuel nodded gravely. "What do you propose, Your Grace?" The Duke moved to his desk and retrieved a second document, one he had kept hidden even from Samuel until now, a sample of Julian's genuine handwriting, taken from old family correspondence. "I have sent for a man in London, an expert in matters of forgery and false documents, who has agreed to examine both this sample and the false confession side by side. If his findings confirm what I already suspect, we will have the proof needed to expose Julian before the magistrate, and to clear Miss Bennet's name entirely before any formal accusation can be brought against her. And if Julian discovers this examination before it is complete, the Duke's expression hardened. Then we will have a far more dangerous problem than a false confession to contend with, Samuel. A cornered man with everything to lose is capable of far worse than forgery, and I do not intend to underestimate my cousin's desperation a second time. Clara woke before dawn, her sleep fitful and shallow, her mind still turning over the conversation she had overheard the night before. She lay in the narrow bed of her small room at the Fox and Crown, watching the gray light slowly brighten beyond the curtains, and made a decision that surprised even herself with its boldness. She would not simply continue on toward whatever uncertain future awaited her. She would return, quietly and carefully, to learn the truth of what was happening at Nethercote Hall. It was not a decision made lightly. She understood the risk of returning to a place from which she had been so coldly dismissed. Understood that if her suspicions were wrong, if the Duke's coldness had been genuine, and her theories nothing more than wishful invention, she would only expose herself to further pain and humiliation. But the alternative, walking away without ever knowing the truth, without ever understanding whether she had been cast out to protect her, or simply discarded without a second thought, felt unbearable now that the possibility of another explanation had taken root in her mind. She dressed quickly and went downstairs, where she found Mrs. Doyle already awake, tending to the morning fire in the small kitchen. "You're up early, miss," the innkeeper said, glancing up with a warm smile. "Will you be continuing your journey today?" "I believe I will," Clara said carefully, "though not quite in the direction I first intended. Mrs. Doyle, might I ask you something? Do you know much of the goings-on up at Nethercote Hall?" Mrs. Doyle's expression shifted, curiosity and caution mingling in equal measure. "A fair bit, I suppose, running an inn so close to the estate. Folk talk when they've had their supper and their ale. Why do you ask, miss? If you don't mind me saying, you seem a touch pale this morning." Clara hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. She decided, on instinct, to trust this woman who had shown her nothing but kindness since her arrival. "I was in service there, until yesterday. I do not fully understand the circumstances of my dismissal, and I overheard some troubling talk last night that has left me wanting answers." Mrs. Doyle's eyes widened slightly, and she set down the poker she had been using to tend the fire, giving Clara her full attention. "You'll be the companion then, the one they say is accused of taking the old Duchess's necklace. I did wonder when William brought you round last night, though I said nothing of it, not wanting to trouble a tired traveler with idle gossip." The confirmation, spoken so plainly, sent a fresh wave of shock through Clara. "It has already spread this far? I only just heard the rumor myself last night, and had no idea it concerned me directly, until this moment. Village gossip travels faster than any carriage, miss, especially when it concerns the great house. From what I've heard, and mind you it's only what I've heard, there's some in the household who don't believe the accusation for a moment. My own niece works in the kitchens up at the hall, and she tells me the housekeeper's been fit to be tied about it, muttering that certain people ought to look closer to home before pointing fingers at an innocent girl." "Closer to home," Clara repeated slowly, meaning Julian Nethercote. Mrs. Doyle glanced toward the door, as though checking that no one else might overhear, before lowering her voice further. "I'll say no more than this, miss. That young man has not been welcome in this village for some time, runs up debts he doesn't pay, treats decent folk with less respect than he'd show a dog, and there's more than one who'd tell you plainly they wouldn't trust him as far as they could throw him. If there's blame to be found for a missing necklace, I know where my own suspicions would settle first." Clara sat with this information for a long moment, feeling the shape of the danger she had sensed the night before solidify into something far more concrete. If the household staff already suspected Julian, if the rumor of her own guilt was already spreading through the village despite having only just been born, then time was working against her, far more urgently than she had realized. She needed to understand the full truth, and she needed to understand it quickly, before whatever scheme Julian had set in motion could reach its conclusion. "Mrs. Doyle, I need to return to the hall, but not through the front gate. Is there anyone in this village who might help me reach the house without announcing my arrival to the entire estate?" The innkeeper studied her for a long moment, weighing something in her own mind, before nodding slowly. "There's my niece, as I mentioned. The one in the kitchens. She comes to market most mornings around this hour to fetch supplies for the house. If you're quick, you might catch her before she starts back, and she could see you brought in quietly through the servant's entrance, if that's truly what you're wanting." Clara thanked her profusely and hurried out into the pale morning light, following Mrs. Doyle's directions toward the village market square. She found the niece easily enough, a young woman named Grace, laden with baskets of vegetables and looking harried as she tried to manage her purchases alone. Clara approached carefully, explaining her situation in low, urgent tones, and found Grace surprisingly receptive once she understood who she was speaking with. "You're the one they're all whispering about," Grace said, studying Clara with open curiosity. "For what it's worth, miss, nobody below stairs believes a word of it. Mrs. Foss has been beside herself, saying it's a disgrace how you were sent away without so much as a proper explanation. She'll want to see you, I should think, though I don't know what His Grace would say if he learned I'd brought you back onto the grounds." "I do not intend to be seen by His Grace at all, if I can help it," Clara said. "I only wish to understand what has truly happened, and perhaps to speak with Mrs. Foss, if she is willing to help me." Grace considered this for a moment, then nodded decisively. "Come along then, and quickly. If we hurry, we can be back before the morning deliveries are expected, and no one need know you were ever here at all." They made their way back toward the estate together, Clara carrying one of the heavier baskets to maintain the appearance of a kitchen errand, should they encounter anyone along the road. The walk felt entirely different from the one she had made the day before, no longer heavy with grief and confusion, but charged instead with a nervous, purposeful energy. She was returning not as a dismissed companion crawling back in humiliation, but as someone determined to uncover the truth of her own circumstances, whatever that truth might prove to be. They approached Nethercote Hall from a rear path that Clara had never used before, winding through a stretch of woodland that bordered the kitchen gardens, emerging finally at a small gate that opened directly onto the servants' entrance. Grace led her quickly inside, through a narrow corridor thick with the smell of baking bread, and into a small storeroom, where she instructed Clara to wait while she fetched the housekeeper. The wait felt agonizingly long, though it could not have been more than a few minutes before the door opened, and Mrs. Foss entered, her expression a mixture of relief and worry, that told Clara immediately how much the older woman had feared for her since her dismissal. "Clara, my dear girl," Mrs. Foss said, taking both of Clara's hands in her own, "I feared we would never see you again, and I have been sick with worry over what has been said about you in this house. You must know, whatever you have heard, that not a soul below stairs believes you capable of the theft they are whispering about. I heard only fragments of the accusation from strangers at an inn in Ashford," Clara admitted. "I do not fully understand what has happened, Mrs. Foss. Can you tell me the truth of it?" Mrs. Foss glanced toward the door, as though ensuring their privacy, before lowering her voice to little more than a whisper. "2 days before you were dismissed, the late Duchess's sapphire necklace went missing from the locked case in her old dressing room. His Grace was beside himself when he discovered it, though he said little about it publicly at the time. Then, the very day before your dismissal, a letter arrived, a confession supposedly written in your own hand, admitting to the theft. I do not believe for one moment that you wrote it, Clara. Your hand is nothing like the sample I was shown, though whoever forged it made a passable effort to disguise the difference." "A confession," Clara repeated, feeling the full weight of the danger settle over her at last. "And His Grace believed it?" "That is what troubles me most," Mrs. Foss said. "He did not seem to believe it, not truly. He was distracted, urgent, almost frantic in the days before he dismissed you, but not in the manner of a man convinced of your guilt, more like a man racing against some danger he could not fully explain. I have served this family for 30 years, Clara, and I have never seen His Grace behave with such strange urgency. Whatever is truly happening in this house, I do not believe it is what it appears to be on the surface." Before Clara could respond, the door opened again, and both women turned sharply, expecting perhaps another servant or Grace returning with news. Instead, they found themselves facing a man Clara had met only twice before during her time at the hall, but whose face she recognized immediately from the family portraits that lined the great staircase. Julian Nethercote stood in the doorway, his expression shifting rapidly from surprise to something colder and far more calculating as his eyes settled on Clara. "Well," he said slowly, a thin smile spreading across his face that did not reach his eyes. This is a fortunate turn of events. The thief returns to the scene of her crime. How very convenient for everyone concerned. Mrs. Foss stepped forward, instinctively, placing herself half between Clara and the doorway. Mr. Nethercote, this is a private matter concerning the household staff, and does not require your involvement. On the contrary, Mrs. Foss, I believe it requires my involvement entirely. Julian stepped further into the small storeroom, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. A woman accused of theft, dismissed from this household under a cloud of suspicion, returns in secret through the servant's entrance, rather than presenting herself openly at the front door. If that does not warrant my attention as a member of this family, I cannot imagine what would. Clara forced herself to remain calm. Though her heart pounded fiercely beneath her composed exterior, she had learned long ago, through years of service in households where a servant's temper could cost her position entirely, how to mask fear and anger alike behind a steady expression. She called on that skill now, with every ounce of discipline she possessed. I returned only to speak with Mrs. Foss, whom I have long considered a friend, she said evenly. I have no interest in confronting anyone, nor in disturbing the household further. I will leave immediately, if that would satisfy you, sir. I do not think it would satisfy me at all, Julian said, his smile widening in a way that made Clara's skin prickle with unease. I think, rather, that the magistrate ought to be informed of your return, given the seriousness of the accusation hanging over you. It would be remiss of me, as a member of this family concerned with justice, to simply let you walk away a second time. There has been no formal accusation, Mrs. Foss said sharply, her earlier deference giving way to open defiance. Only a letter of uncertain origin, which His Grace himself has not confirmed as genuine. You have no authority to summon the magistrate over a private household matter, Mr. Nethercote, and I would remind you that this is not your house to command. Something flickered across Julian's face at this. A brief flash of anger quickly smoothed back into practiced calm. Not yet, perhaps, he said quietly, and though his words were soft, they carried a weight that made both women go still. He seemed to catch himself, realizing he had revealed more than he intended, and quickly recovered his earlier composed tone. Though I hardly see how my authority in this household is relevant to the matter of a stolen necklace and a written confession. A confession you yourself likely arranged, Clara said, the words leaving her before she could fully consider the wisdom of speaking them aloud. The room went silent. Mrs. Foss's eyes widened in alarm, and Julian's expression hardened into something far more dangerous than his earlier practiced menace. That is a serious accusation to level against a member of this family, he said, his voice dropping low. One that could bring considerable trouble upon you, given your already precarious position. Clara held his gaze, refusing to let her fear show, though she could feel her pulse racing in her throat. I only repeat what has already been whispered throughout the village, sir. That a certain gentleman finds himself deeply in debt, and that a missing necklace, along with a conveniently timed confession pointing blame elsewhere, might prove rather beneficial to a man in such circumstances. For a moment, Clara thought Julian might strike her. Such was the fury that flashed across his face. But he mastered himself quickly, his expression smoothing once more into cold civility, though his eyes remained hard as flint. Village gossip is a poor foundation for accusation, Miss Bennet. I would think a woman in your position would be more careful about the enemies she chooses to make. Is that a threat, Mr. Nethercote? Merely an observation. He glanced between Clara and Mrs. Foss, seeming to calculate his next move with the careful precision of a man accustomed to manipulating situations to his own advantage. I believe I shall inform His Grace of your return immediately. Let him decide how to handle this matter, since it seems the staff cannot be trusted to manage it appropriately on their own. He turned and left the storeroom without another word, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with unhurried confidence that somehow felt more threatening than any open aggression could have been. Mrs. Foss let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since he entered. Clara, you should not have spoken so plainly to him. He is a dangerous man when crossed, and I fear you have made yourself a target now, in a way you were not before. I know, Clara admitted, her hands trembling slightly now that the confrontation had passed. I do not know what came over me, only that hearing him speak with such calculated menace, watching him threaten us both so plainly, beneath his polite words, I could not remain silent. We must get you away from here, quickly, before he returns with His Grace, or with the magistrate himself. But before either woman could act on this plan, the door opened once more. And this time it was not Julian who entered, but the Duke himself. His expression a storm of emotions Clara could not fully read. Relief and alarm and something else entirely mingling together, as his eyes found her standing safe within the small storeroom. "Clara," he said, and the use of her given name, spoken without title or formality, for the first time since she had known him, struck her with the force of genuine shock. "Julian informed me you had returned to the estate. I came immediately, fearing what he might do if he found you alone." "Your Grace," she said carefully, retreating instinctively back into the formal distance that had governed their relationship for 2 years, though something in his expression made her question whether that distance still served any purpose between them. "I did not intend to cause trouble. I only wished to understand the truth of my dismissal." The Duke's expression softened, though the tension in his shoulders remained. "Then it seems the time for concealment has passed entirely, given Julian's involvement in this moment. Clara, I must speak with you privately, and I must tell you the truth of everything that has happened these past days, before Julian finds some way to twist this situation further to his advantage." Mrs. Foss, sensing the shift in the room, excused herself quietly, promising to keep watch for any sign of Julian's return, before slipping from the storeroom and leaving Clara alone with the Duke for the first time since her dismissal. "You should sit," the Duke said, gesturing to a small stool near the wall, though Clara remained standing, too unsettled to accept even this small comfort while so much remained unexplained between them. "I would rather hear the truth first, Your Grace, if you do not mind." He nodded, understanding her need for clarity before comfort. 2 days before I dismissed you, my late wife's sapphire necklace was discovered missing from her dressing room. The following day, a letter arrived, purporting to be a confession, written in your own hand, admitting to the theft. I did not believe it, not for a moment, having known your character these past 2 years far too well to credit such an accusation. But I recognized immediately that whoever had forged the letter intended it to be presented to the magistrate, and that if you remained in this household, unaware of the danger closing around you, you would face formal accusation before I could prove your innocence. "So you dismissed me," Clara said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn even as fresh questions multiplied in its place. "To remove me from that danger, before the accusation could be formally brought." "Yes. But I could not tell you the truth of my reasoning, not while Julian, whom I already suspected of orchestrating the forgery, remained watching every movement within this household. If I had shown you any kindness in that dismissal, any hint that I believed in your innocence, word would have reached him within hours, and he would have moved against you before you could safely leave the estate grounds. I made the dismissal appear as cold and final as I could manage, hoping to convince him that I had accepted the accusation without question, buying myself time to prove the forgery before he could act further." Clara felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had carried since the moment he had spoken those cold words in his study, releasing at last beneath the weight of this explanation. And yet beneath the relief sat a fresh ache, the memory of how thoroughly convincing his coldness had been, how completely she had believed herself despised and discarded. "You might have found some other way," she said quietly. "You might have trusted me with the truth, even in secret, rather than letting me believe myself so utterly rejected." The Duke's expression filled with genuine regret. "I know. I have thought of little else since you left this house yesterday morning. I told myself it was necessity, that your safety required such deception, and perhaps it did. But I will not pretend it did not cost me greatly to speak those words to you, knowing the pain they would cause, and knowing I could not offer any comfort against that pain without risking everything I hoped to protect." "The carriages," Clara said suddenly, remembering Henry's account from the stable yard. "You sent every carriage from the stables after me. I could not bear the thought of you walking those roads alone, unprotected, while genuine danger from highwaymen remained a real possibility, on top of whatever scheme Julian might attempt against you directly. I instructed every driver and rider available to watch the roads, to offer you safe passage should you accept it, though I dared not reveal my true purpose, even to them, beyond the general concern for your safety." Clara thought of William and his brother, of their careful evasion when she had pressed them about the Duke's intentions, and understood now the constraint under which they had been operating, torn between their instructions to protect her and their inability to fully explain why such protection was necessary. "And now?" she asked. "Julian knows I have returned. He has already threatened to involve the magistrate. What happens now, Your Grace? The Duke's expression hardened with renewed purpose. Now we move faster than he expects. But I have sent a document expert from London to examine the forged confession against samples of Julian's genuine handwriting. His findings should arrive within days, perhaps sooner if I send urgent word requesting expedited results. Once we have proof of the forgery, we can expose Julian before the magistrate ourselves, turning his own scheme against him entirely. And until then, if he attempts to have me arrested before this proof arrives? The question hung heavy in the air between them, and Clara watched the Duke's jaw tighten with the weight of a problem he had clearly already been considering before entering this room. Until then, he said slowly, I will not allow it. Whatever I must do, whatever risk I must take to my own position and reputation, I will not let Julian's scheme claim you as its victim, while I have any power left to prevent it. The words had barely left the Duke's mouth when raised voices sounded from the corridor beyond the storeroom, growing louder and more urgent with each passing second. The door burst open to reveal Mrs. Foss, her face pale with alarm. Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but Mr. Nethercote has ridden into the village himself. He has gone to fetch the magistrate directly, saying he will not wait for the household to handle the matter through proper channels. The Duke's expression darkened with fury, barely contained. He moves faster than I anticipated. How long ago did he leave? Perhaps a quarter hour, Your Grace. He took the swiftest horse in the stables. Then we have little time. The Duke turned to Clara, his eyes intense with urgent calculation. The magistrate in this district is a reasonable man, but he will be obligated to act on a formal accusation once it is properly presented, regardless of his personal doubts. If Julian reaches him first, with the forged confession in hand, you could find yourself facing formal charges before I can present evidence of the forgery. What would you have me do, Your Grace? I need you to remain here, safely within the household, while I ride to intercept Julian before he reaches the magistrate's residence. If I can delay him, even briefly, it may buy enough time for word to arrive from London regarding the handwriting examination. Mrs. Foss stepped forward with quiet determination. I will keep her safe, Your Grace. There is a room in the east wing that has stood locked and unused since the old Duchess's passing. No one would think to search for her there, and I hold the only key. The Duke nodded, already moving toward the door, then paused, turning back to Clara, with an expression that softened, despite the urgency of the moment. I am sorry, Clara, for all of this, for the pain my dismissal caused you, for the danger you have been drawn into through no fault of your own, for every moment of fear this scheme has forced upon you. When this is finished, when Julian's treachery has been fully exposed and your name cleared beyond any doubt, I intend to make amends properly, in whatever manner you will permit me. Before Clara could respond, he was gone, his footsteps hurrying down the corridor toward the stables, calling for his fastest horse to be readied immediately. Mrs. Foss wasted no time, leading Clara swiftly through a maze of servants' corridors toward the east wing, a part of the house Clara had rarely visited during her 2 years of service, its rooms having remained closed and largely forgotten since the late Duchess's death some years before. The housekeeper produced a heavy iron key from the ring at her waist and unlocked a door at the end of a dusty corridor, revealing a modest sitting room, its furniture draped in protective cloth, the air within stale from long disuse. You will be safe here, Clara. I will bring you food and water, and I will keep watch for any sign of trouble. No one will think to search this part of the house, and even if they did, the door locks securely from the inside as well as out. Thank you, Mrs. Foss, for everything you have done, both now and these past 2 years. The older woman's expression softened with genuine affection. You have been a credit to this household since the day you arrived, Clara Bennet, and I will not stand by and watch you suffer for another man's greed and desperation. Now settle yourself as comfortably as you can manage, and trust that His Grace will do everything in his power to see this matter resolved swiftly. Left alone in the dim, dust-covered room, Clara found herself unable to settle despite Mrs. Foss's assurances. She paced the length of the small space, her mind racing through every possible outcome of the confrontation now unfolding beyond these walls. Would the Duke reach Julian in time? Would the magistrate, once properly informed, be willing to wait for proof before acting on a formal accusation? And beneath these practical worries sat a quieter, more personal question that she could not fully silence. no matter how urgently the danger of her situation demanded her full attention. What had the Duke meant, exactly, when he spoke of making amends in whatever manner she would permit? She forced herself to set the question aside, focusing instead on the more immediate crisis, and settled into a chair near the shuttered window, straining to hear any sound from beyond the room that might indicate how events were unfolding elsewhere in the house. Hours passed in this manner, the light beyond the shuttered window shifting slowly from midday brightness toward the softer gold of afternoon. Mrs. Foss returned once, bringing a simple meal and reassurance that no word had yet arrived regarding the Duke's confrontation with Julian, nor any sign of the magistrate approaching the estate. The waiting proved almost unbearable, each passing minute stretching Clara's nerves tighter, until finally, as evening began to settle over the grounds outside, she heard the sound of the corridor door opening once more. She rose quickly, expecting Mrs. Foss, but found instead the Duke himself standing in the doorway, his riding clothes dusty and disheveled, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of exhaustion and relief. "It is done," he said without preamble. "I reached Julian before he could present his accusation to the magistrate. I informed him that I had already sent the confession for expert examination, and that any formal accusation brought against you before those results arrived would only serve to draw closer scrutiny to his own recent financial dealings." He did not appreciate the implication, but he understood well enough what I was suggesting, and agreed to withhold any formal accusation until the examination's findings could be reviewed. "He agreed so easily?" Clara asked, surprised by this sudden cooperation from a man who had seemed so determined to see her accused mere hours before. "Not easily," the Duke admitted, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "I made it quite clear that I would not hesitate to investigate his own financial affairs publicly and thoroughly, should he continue to press this matter without proper proof. Julian is many things, Clara, but he is not foolish enough to invite closer scrutiny of his own circumstances when he has so much to hide." Relief washed through Clara, though it remained tempered by the knowledge that this was only a temporary reprieve, not a final resolution. "And the examination results, Your Grace? When might they arrive?" "I have sent an urgent request for expedited findings. With fortune, we should hear something within 2 days, perhaps 3 at the outside. Until then, I would prefer you remain here, safely away from Julian's reach, though I recognize this room offers little comfort for an extended stay. I have endured worse, Your Grace, in service to households far less generous than this one." Something in his expression shifted at this, a flicker of pain quickly masked. "You should not have to endure any of this at all, Clara. None of it. I have thought, these past 2 days, of little beyond how thoroughly I have failed to protect you from a danger that was never truly yours to bear." "You did protect me," she said gently. "In your own way, through means I did not understand until today. I was angry with you, Your Grace, angry and hurt beyond anything I have felt in years, believing myself discarded without explanation. But I understand now what that coldness cost you to perform, and what it accomplished in protecting me from Julian's scheme." The Duke moved closer, though he stopped himself at a respectful distance, some remnant of propriety holding him back despite the evident emotion in his expression. "I would not have you believe, even for a moment longer than necessary, that my feelings toward you were ever what that dismissal suggested. Clara, these past 2 years, your presence in this household has meant far more to me than I have permitted myself to acknowledge, even to myself. I told myself it was improper, given the difference in our circumstances, to entertain feelings beyond simple friendship and respect. But watching you walk away yesterday morning, believing yourself despised by my own hand, I understood with painful clarity how much I had been deceiving myself all along." Clara's breath caught, the weight of his words settling over her with a force she had not expected. Not here, not now, in the midst of danger and uncertainty that had consumed every waking thought since her dismissal.
"Your Grace, I do not know what to say to such an admission, given everything else that remains unresolved between us."
"Then say nothing yet," he said gently. "I do not offer this confession to press you for any response in the midst of such difficulty. I only wanted you to know the truth of my feelings, whatever else remains unsettled, so that you need never again wonder whether my coldness toward you was genuine." "It was never genuine, Clara. Not for one moment." They stood together in the dim light of the abandoned room, the weight of everything unspoken between them finally given voice, even as the danger of Julian's scheme remained unresolved beyond these walls. Clara felt something shift within her chest. Hope and fear intertwining in equal measure. Hope for a future she had not dared to imagine possible, and fear that danger might yet steal that future away before it could ever properly begin. The moment was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor beyond, and both of them turned sharply as Mrs. Foss appeared in the doorway, her expression tight with fresh alarm. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but there is a rider approaching from the main road, moving at considerable speed." One of the stable boys recognized the livery. "It is a messenger from London." The Duke's expression sharpened immediately, urgency replacing the softer emotion of moments before. "The examination results, arriving far sooner than I anticipated. Come, we must receive this messenger properly, before Julian learns of his arrival and attempts to intercept the findings before we can review them ourselves." They hurried together through the corridors toward the front of the house, Mrs. Foss leading the way, while Clara followed close behind the Duke, her earlier fatigue forgotten in the sudden rush of anticipation. They reached the entrance hall just as the messenger, a young man in travel-worn clothes, was being shown inside by the butler. "Your Grace," the messenger said, offering a hurried bow before producing a sealed letter from within his coat. "I ride directly from London, from Mr. Whitfield, the document examiner you engaged. He instructed me to deliver this into your hands personally, and to inform you that his findings were conclusive enough that he felt no need to delay their delivery through the ordinary post." The Duke accepted the letter with hands that were not entirely steady, breaking the seal immediately and scanning its contents with an intensity that made the entrance hall fall utterly silent around him. Clara watched his face carefully, searching for any indication of what the letter contained, and saw his expression shift gradually from tension to something like fierce satisfaction. "It is conclusive," he said finally, looking up to meet Clara's eyes. "Mr. Whitfield states unequivocally that the confession letter was written by the same hand responsible for several samples of Julian's correspondence, disguised through deliberate alteration of certain letters and slant, but consistent enough in its underlying structure to leave no reasonable doubt as to its true author. He has included detailed analysis comparing specific letter formations between the two documents, evidence he states would satisfy any reasonable magistrate." Relief flooded through Clara so completely that she felt momentarily unsteady on her feet, one hand reaching instinctively for the nearby wall to support herself. "Then it is proven. Julian forged the confession himself." "It is proven," the Duke confirmed, his voice carrying a grim satisfaction that had been building since the moment he first suspected his cousin's treachery. "And now we must ensure he faces the consequences of that treachery before he can attempt any further scheme against you or against this family's reputation." Even as he spoke these words, the sound of another horse approaching at speed reached them through the still open front door, and moments later, Julian himself appeared in the entrance hall, his expression a mixture of fury and barely concealed panic that told Clara he had somehow learned of the messenger's arrival and rushed back to the estate in an attempt to intercept whatever news had come. "Edmund," Julian said, his voice tight with forced calm as his eyes took in the scene before him, the messenger, the opened letter, Clara standing safely beside the Duke rather than hidden away, as he had presumably expected. "What is the meaning of this gathering?" "The meaning, Julian, is that your scheme has finally been exposed beyond any possibility of denial." The Duke's voice carried a cold authority that Clara had never heard him direct at anyone before, not even in the moment of her own dismissal. "I have received confirmation from an expert document examiner that the confession letter accusing Miss Bennet of theft was written by your own hand, disguised, but not skillfully enough to escape proper scrutiny." Julian's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly at this revelation, his face draining of color before flushing red with what might have been either shame or fresh anger. "That is absurd. Some London charlatan's opinion proves nothing definitively. I could hire a dozen experts myself who would dispute such findings." "You could," the Duke agreed, "though I doubt any honest examiner would reach a different conclusion, given the evidence Mr. Whitfield has compiled. And even setting aside the question of the confession's authorship, there remains the matter of your considerable gambling debts, Julian. Debts I have documented myself these past weeks, through inquiries made among your creditors in London. Debts that provide more than sufficient motive for a man desperate enough to fabricate both a theft and its false confession, hoping to claim the necklace's value for himself, while directing suspicion safely away from his own circumstances. "You have been investigating me," Julian said, his voice dropping to something dangerous and low. "Behind my back, gathering evidence like some common informant, while presenting yourself publicly as though nothing were amiss. I have been protecting an innocent woman from your treachery," the Duke replied evenly, "using whatever means necessary to expose the truth before your scheme could claim her as its victim. I would do far more than simple investigation to protect her, Julian, as I believe you are only now beginning to understand." For a long moment, Julian said nothing, his eyes darting between the Duke's unyielding expression and Clara's steady gaze, calculating perhaps whether any avenue of denial or deflection remained available to him. Finally, something in his posture seemed to collapse, the fight draining out of him as he recognized the hopelessness of his position. "What do you intend to do with this evidence?" he asked, his earlier bravado replaced now with something closer to genuine fear. "That depends entirely on you, Julian, and on how you choose to conduct yourself going forward." The Duke's tone remained cold, but carried a note of calculation that told Clara he had already considered this question at length before this confrontation ever began. "I could present this evidence to the magistrate immediately and see you formally charged with forgery and attempted false accusation, crimes that would carry severe consequences for your reputation and your freedom alike. Given the disgrace such proceedings would bring upon our family name, however, I am prepared to consider an alternative." "An alternative?" Julian's voice carried a fragile note of hope now, though he seemed to understand instinctively that whatever alternative was offered would come at considerable cost to his pride and independence. "You will leave England," the Duke said, "immediately and without delay. I will settle your outstanding debts on the condition that you depart for the colonies and do not return to trouble this family, or Miss Bennet, ever again. Should you refuse this offer, or should you attempt to return to England at any point in the future, I will present the evidence I have gathered to the appropriate authorities without hesitation, and you will face whatever consequences the law deems appropriate for your actions." Julian's jaw tightened, humiliation evident in every line of his face, but the alternative the Duke described clearly offered him a path forward that formal prosecution would not, however diminished that path might be, compared to the future he had once envisioned for himself. "You would have me exile myself entirely, abandon whatever standing I have built in society, simply to avoid facing proper judgment for my actions? I would have you accept the consequences of your own choices, Julian, in whatever form allows this family, and the innocent woman you sought to destroy, to move forward without further disruption to our lives. You have brought this circumstance upon yourself through your own desperation and greed. I am simply offering you the least painful path available, given the severity of what you have done." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, Julian's expression cycling through anger, humiliation, and finally a grim, defeated acceptance. "Very well," he said at last, his voice hollow. "I will accept your terms, Edmund, though I do not expect you to believe any expression of regret I might offer now. I do not require your regret, Julian. I require only your absence, and your silence regarding these matters going forward." The Duke's expression softened only slightly, some remnant of family feeling perhaps surfacing, despite everything that had passed between them. "Go and prepare for your departure. I will arrange passage and settle your debts as promised, but I expect you gone from this estate within the week." Julian said nothing further, only turned and left the entrance hall with what remained of his dignity gathered around him like a threadbare cloak, his footsteps echoing hollow against the stone floor as he disappeared toward the stairs leading to his rooms. Once he had gone, the tension that had gripped the entrance hall seemed to release all at once, and Clara found herself trembling slightly with the aftermath of everything that had unfolded in the span of a single afternoon. The Duke turned to her immediately, his expression filled with concern. "Are you well, Clara? This has been an exhausting ordeal, and I would understand entirely if you needed time to recover from everything that has happened today." "I am well," she said, though her voice carried the tremor of adrenaline still working its way through her body. "Relieved, mostly, though I confess I can scarcely believe it is truly resolved. This morning I woke uncertain of my future, believing myself despised and discarded, and now, within the span of a single day, I find myself cleared of accusation entirely, with the true culprit exposed and facing consequences for his treachery. "It is resolved," the Duke confirmed gently. "Your name is cleared, Clara, fully and permanently, with evidence sufficient to satisfy any doubt that might otherwise have lingered. Julian will trouble you no further, and this household will know the full truth of your innocence before the day is finished, so that no whisper of doubt remains among the staff or the wider community." Mrs. Foss, who had remained quietly nearby throughout the confrontation, stepped forward now, with visible relief written across her weathered features. "I will see that word spreads properly through the household, Your Grace, so that everyone understands the truth before evening falls. And I dare say the village will hear the correct version of events soon enough as well, once proper word is sent. Thank you, Mrs. Foss, for everything you have done today, and these past 2 years in service to this family." As the housekeeper departed to spread word of the resolution throughout the household, Clara found herself alone once more, with the Duke in the quiet entrance hall, the golden light of late afternoon slanting through the tall windows and casting long shadows across the polished floor. She thought of everything that had passed between them since morning, the pain of dismissal giving way to confusion, to danger, to the slow unraveling of a truth far more complicated than she could have imagined, and finally, to this moment of quiet resolution, standing together in the aftermath of a crisis neither of them had chosen, but both had faced with equal determination. "You said something earlier," she ventured carefully, "before the messenger arrived, about your feelings toward me. I do not know if the circumstances of this day permit proper reflection on such matters, given everything else that has occurred." The Duke's expression softened into something warmer than she had seen from him even in their gentlest moments before her dismissal. "I meant every word, Clara, regardless of the circumstances surrounding their delivery. Perhaps this is not the ideal moment for such conversation, given the exhaustion and danger of the day now finally past. But I find myself unwilling to let another moment pass without ensuring you understand fully what I feel, now that the danger threatening you has finally been resolved." Clara felt her heart quicken at his words, though caution, born of years spent guarding herself against disappointment, held her from responding too readily. "Your Grace, I must ask you to consider carefully what you are suggesting. The difference in our circumstances remains as real now as it was yesterday. I am a companion, dependent on employment for my very livelihood, while you hold a title and estate that carries expectations I could never hope to fully meet." "I have considered it carefully," he said, taking a step closer, close enough now that she could see the sincerity written plainly across his features. "I have considered little else these past 2 days, Clara, weighing every practical objection society might raise against what I feel for you, and finding none of them sufficient to outweigh the simple truth that I cannot imagine continuing forward in this life without you beside me. Titles and expectations matter little when measured against genuine happiness, and I have not known genuine happiness, not truly, since before my first wife's passing, until you came into this household and reminded me what warmth and companionship could feel like again. Your family, your standing in society, would surely object to such a match. My family consists primarily of Julian, who will shortly be departing for the colonies, and a handful of distant relations who have shown little interest in my affairs, beyond what inheritance they might eventually claim. As for society's opinion, I have spent enough years living according to its rigid expectations to understand how little genuine satisfaction such adherence provides. I would rather face whatever gossip or disapproval might follow than spend another day pretending indifference to feelings I have carried, quietly, and against my own better judgment, for far longer than I have permitted myself to acknowledge, even to myself." Clara felt tears gathering unexpectedly at his words, the accumulated weight of the day's exhaustion and fear finally giving way to something gentler and infinitely more welcome. "I do not know what to say, Your Grace. This morning I believed myself entirely alone in the world, dismissed and discarded, with nothing before me but uncertain struggle. Now you offer me a future I scarcely dared imagine even in my most private hopes. You need not answer immediately," he said gently, though his eyes remained fixed on hers with an intensity that suggested how much her answer meant to him regardless of his patient words. "I understand this day has brought more than enough upheaval already, without adding the weight of such a significant decision atop everything else. Take whatever time you need, Clara. I will wait as long as necessary, provided you will allow me the privilege of your continued presence in this household while you consider it, not as a dismissed companion returning under sufferance, but as an honored guest, free to come and go as you wish, unburdened by any expectation beyond your own genuine feelings on the matter. Clara looked at him for a long moment, weighing the practical caution that had governed her decisions throughout her difficult life, against the quiet certainty growing within her chest, a certainty that had perhaps been building for far longer than she had permitted herself to acknowledge. Through countless small moments of shared laughter and quiet understanding, across 2 years of service in this household. "I do not need time, Your Grace," she said finally, her voice steady, despite the trembling emotion beneath it. "I have known my own feelings for longer than I dared admit, even to myself, fearing the impropriety of hoping for something so far beyond what my circumstances seem to allow. If you are certain, truly certain, that this is what you want, then I would be honored to accept whatever future you are offering me." The Duke's expression transformed entirely at her words, relief and joy mingling together in a way that erased years of careful, guarded formality from his features, revealing something younger and more genuinely happy than Clara had ever witnessed from him before. "Then let us not waste another moment on formality and hesitation, Clara. I have wasted enough time already, hiding behind duty and propriety, when I might have simply told you the truth of my feelings, long before circumstances forced my hand." In the weeks that followed, word of Julian's disgrace and departure spread quietly through both the household and the surrounding village, carried along the same channels of gossip that had first spread the false rumor of Clara's guilt, though this time the truth traveled with equal speed, restoring her reputation completely among those who had briefly doubted her. Mrs. Foss took particular satisfaction in correcting anyone foolish enough to repeat the old accusation in her hearing, and even Mrs. Doyle at the Fox and Crown, upon learning the full truth of events, declared to anyone who would listen that she had suspected Julian's involvement from the very beginning. The Duke settled Julian's considerable debts as promised, and arranged passage for his cousin aboard a ship bound for the colonies, watching from the dock with an expression that mixed relief with a lingering, complicated sorrow for the family bond that circumstance had forced him to sever so completely. Julian offered no farewell beyond a stiff nod as he boarded, his pride too wounded to permit any warmer parting, and the Duke returned to Nethercote Hall that evening with the quiet satisfaction of a difficult chapter finally closed. Clara, meanwhile, found herself navigating an entirely new position within the household, no longer companion but honored guest, and eventually, as the weeks progressed and the Duke's intentions became formally known throughout the county, betrothed to the very man who had once, however necessarily, dismissed her with such convincing coldness. The transition brought its own challenges, adjusting to a role so far removed from anything she had previously known, learning to navigate the expectations of society that would now govern her position as future Duchess of Nethercote. But she faced these challenges with the same steady composure that had carried her through every difficulty before, and found, to her quiet relief, that the Duke remained beside her through every uncertain moment, offering patient guidance without ever making her feel diminished by her unfamiliarity with the world she was now entering. Their wedding took place in early autumn, a modest ceremony by the standards of noble households, attended primarily by those who had shown genuine kindness throughout the difficult weeks of Clara's ordeal. Mrs. Foss wept openly throughout the entire proceeding, declaring afterward that she had never witnessed a more fitting match in all her years of service. William and his brother Thomas attended as well, having become something like friends to Clara through their shared experience of that long, uncertain journey along the North Road. Even Grace and Mrs. Doyle traveled from Ashford to witness the ceremony, proud participants in a story they had each played their own small part in shaping. Standing before the assembled guests, exchanging vows with the man who had once curtly dismissed her, only to spend the following days moving heaven and earth to protect her from a danger she had not even known existed, Clara felt the full weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. The fear and confusion of that first cold dismissal, the long walk down an empty road not knowing what future awaited her, the strange kindness of strangers sent secretly to watch over her safety, the growing danger of Julian's scheme, and finally the truth revealed and justice served, all of it converging now into this single moment of quiet, hard-won happiness. "I release you from any doubt you might still carry," the Duke said quietly to her, once the formal ceremony had concluded, and they stood together receiving the congratulations of their gathered guests, echoing deliberately the words that had once caused her such pain. "Not from this marriage, nor from my affection, which I intend to prove to you every day for the remainder of our lives together. but from any lingering fear that you were ever anything less than cherished. From the very first moment I recognized what you meant to me." Clara smiled, the memory of that painful morning now transformed entirely by everything that had followed it. "And I release you, Your Grace, from any guilt you might still carry over the necessity of that cruelty. It brought us, in the end, to precisely where we were always meant to arrive." They spent that evening walking together, through the same East Garden, where their friendship had first deepened into something more. The roses his mother had planted, years before, still blooming in the cooling autumn air. And Clara understood, with the quiet certainty of hard-won happiness, that whatever challenges the future might bring, she would face them now not alone, but beside a man who had proven, through action, rather than mere words, the true depth of his devotion. Winter settled over Nethercote Hall some months later, bringing with it a stillness that Clara had come to treasure after the turbulence of the previous autumn. She stood one morning in the small library, now her favorite room in the entire house, arranging a fresh delivery of books when Samuel entered with an expression she had learned to read carefully over the months of her new life as Duchess. "A letter has arrived, Your Grace, forwarded from the shipping office in Bristol. It concerns Mr. Julian Nethercote." Clara felt a chill pass through her, despite the warmth of the fire nearby. She had believed that chapter of her life fully closed, Julian's departure marking the end of any danger he might pose. "What does it say, Samuel?" "I could not say, Your Grace. It is addressed directly to His Grace, and marked urgent." She found Edmund in his study within minutes, and together they opened the letter, reading its contents with mounting concern. The ship carrying Julian to the colonies had encountered difficulty at sea, forced to make an unscheduled return to an English port due to storm damage, and Julian, rather than waiting for repairs and resuming his intended voyage, had disappeared from the ship entirely during the delay, his current whereabouts unknown. "He has broken the terms of our agreement," Edmund said grimly, setting the letter aside. "If he remains in England, defying the arrangement that spared him formal prosecution, I will have no choice but to present the evidence against him to the magistrate after all." Clara felt the old anxiety stirring within her, though tempered now by the confidence she had built over months of facing difficulty alongside her husband rather than alone. "Do you believe he intends some further scheme against us?" "I do not know what he intends," Edmund admitted. "But I will not underestimate him a second time. I will send word to every contact I retain in London and the surrounding counties, and I will increase the household's vigilance until we understand precisely where he has gone and what he might be planning." Days passed with no further word, the uncertainty weighing heavily on the household despite outward appearances of normal routine continuing undisturbed. Clara found herself unable to fully relax, glancing more often than usual toward windows and doorways, a habit she had thought long abandoned since the resolution of the previous autumn's crisis. It was on a cold evening nearly a fortnight after the letter's arrival that a stranger appeared at the estate's front gate, requesting audience with the Duke on a matter he described only as urgent family business. Edmund received him cautiously in the study, with Samuel positioned discreetly nearby, and Clara insisting, despite her husband's initial reluctance, on being present for whatever news the visitor carried. The stranger introduced himself as a solicitor engaged by Julian some weeks prior, before his disappearance from the ship. He carried with him a sealed document that Julian had apparently left in his keeping, along with instructions that it be delivered to the Duke should he fail to make contact within a specified period. Edmund broke the seal with visible apprehension and read the contents in tense silence while Clara waited, her hands clasped tightly together, for whatever news the letter might contain. Finally he looked up, his expression shifting from wariness to something closer to weary relief. "He writes to inform me that he has decided against returning to claim any further advantage from our family connection," Edmund said slowly, reading portions aloud. "He states that the storm at sea gave him considerable time to reflect upon his actions, and that he has chosen instead to make his own way, independently, under a different name, in a distant part of the country where his history will not follow him. He asks only that I not pursue the matter further, and offers, in exchange for my continued silence regarding the forgery, his own permanent silence regarding any claim upon this family's name or fortune." Clara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Do you believe him, Edmund? After everything that has happened, can his word be trusted?" Edmund considered this for a long moment, turning the letter over thoughtfully in his hands. "I believe, strangely enough, that I do. There is something different in this letter. A genuine humility I did not expect from him, forged perhaps by whatever hardship he faced during that storm at sea. Whether that change proves lasting, only time will tell, but I am inclined to accept his offer of mutual silence, provided he honors his side of the arrangement and never again attempts contact with this family or with you directly. The solicitor, for his part, confirmed that he had been engaged only for this single task and that Julian had settled his fee in full before departing, offering no further information regarding his client's eventual destination. He took his leave shortly after, disappearing back into the cold winter evening as mysteriously as he had arrived, leaving Clara and Edmund alone once more with the strange, unresolved conclusion to a chapter both had believed already closed. In the weeks that followed, no further word came from Julian, and gradually, the household's heightened vigilance eased back into its familiar peaceful rhythm. Clara found herself, more and more, able to set aside the lingering anxieties of that difficult autumn, trusting instead in the genuine security of the life she had built alongside Edmund, a life built not on false appearances or convenient assumptions, but on hard-won truth and tested devotion. Spring arrived at Nethercote Hall with its usual gentle transformation. The gardens Edmund's mother had planted decades before bursting once more into vibrant color, the roses along the eastern wall unfurling their first fragrant blooms, just as they had on that afternoon, when Clara had first begun to recognize her own growing feelings for the man who would become her husband. She walked those gardens often now, sometimes alone in quiet reflection, sometimes accompanied by Edmund himself, and occasionally, as the months progressed, joined by young Henry, who had been promoted from stable boy to junior groundskeeper under her personal recommendation, delighted to finally have proper purpose within the household that had shaped so much of his young life. Mrs. Foss remained as devoted as ever, though her role had shifted subtly to accommodate the new Duchess's growing confidence in managing the household's daily affairs, and she took particular pride in watching Clara flourish into a role that suited her far better than either of them might have initially predicted. William and Thomas visited occasionally from the village, always welcomed warmly, their friendship with the Duchess remaining a source of quiet amusement among the more traditionally minded members of the county's aristocracy, who found such familiarity between a duchess and common village men rather unconventional, though Clara cared little for such opinions, having learned through hard experience how little society's rigid expectations truly mattered when weighed against genuine loyalty and kindness. One evening in late spring, as Clara and Edmund walked together through the garden in the fading golden light, she found herself reflecting aloud on everything that had brought them to this peaceful moment. "Do you ever think of that morning," she asked, "when you spoke those cold words to me in your study, believing it the only way to keep me safe?" "Often," Edmund admitted. "It remains, I think, the hardest thing I have ever done, watching you curtsy and leave that room, believing yourself despised, knowing the pain those words caused you, and knowing I could offer no comfort against it, without risking everything I hope to protect." "I understand now why it was necessary," Clara said, "though I confess, at the time, I could not have imagined that such cruelty concealed such devotion beneath it. Every carriage sent along every road, every rider watching for my safety, all of it hidden behind words designed to convince me I meant nothing to you at all." "You meant everything," Edmund said quietly, taking her hand in his own, as they continued walking beneath the blooming roses. "You mean everything still, Clara, and I intend to spend every remaining day of my life proving that truth to you, so thoroughly and so consistently, that you never again need wonder, even for a single moment, whether you are cherished." Clara smiled, leaning gently against his shoulder as they walked, the garden around them fragrant and alive with the promise of a new season, a new chapter in a story that had begun with such painful uncertainty, and had grown, through trial and truth and tested devotion, into something far more lasting than either of them could have imagined on that cold morning, when a curtsy and a dismissal had set everything in motion. Behind them, the great house stood warm against the fading light, no longer merely an estate she had once served within, but a home she now belonged to fully, in every sense that truly mattered, built not on convenient appearances, but on the hard-won foundation of truth finally spoken, and love finally, fearlessly, embraced.